Somehow in this series, there's been this, last few weeks, there's been this like welcome up moment. And I don't like it because then you all have to clap and then you don't clap and I feel awkward and you feel awkward and the whole thing. So, but hopefully this is the last welcome up. I'm going to be here for a while. So, I'm thrown a little bit for a loop because Dee was like, hey, go to Stanley, don't bother coming to church. And then he was like, pull your phones out, you don't have to pay attention. So give me a second to gather myself. This is our last Sunday in Songs of Summer. And if you're joining us for the first time or you've been here the whole summer, the big picture is that like there's a spiritual mixtape for our lives. There's music that's part of our faith journey. So before as a follower of Jesus, I was introduced to music that drew me to God, that spoke about who he was and who I am. And for some of you, it's part of your daily rhythm. You're like, a day doesn't go by that I don't pull some music up that encourages my heart. And I thought about, jumping into today, and I wanted to tell you a story, but I'm like, I shouldn't because it kind of sounds made up. And then you're going to spend the rest of the morning wondering if I lied or if I'm crazy. But I told the last service, so half the people know. So we're just going to do it this morning. So I'm not musical. I've always loved music, but I'm not musical. I've never really been good at learning how to sing or play anything. That's not the gifts I have. But I always wanted to. And so on my journey, I ended up at a place where I'd become a follower of Jesus. So I'm a Christian. And there's a team going to Tanzania, and I'm going with that team. And then they say, hey, we need somebody to lead music. It's part of the Christian community. Often we sing together and we celebrate who God is. It's part of every Sunday when we gather. And no one on our team could play guitar, myself included. And then I'm a brand new Christian, okay? So put yourself in my shoes. I believe in the resurrection, though, so I do believe anything is possible. And this weird Christian walks up to me, and they're like, hey, man, God told me He's going to give you the gift of guitar, and you're going to lead your team in music. And I was like, oh my goodness, this guy's so weird. That happened at night. I dreamt that night that I learned how to play guitar. And I woke up the next day, and I could play guitar. I'm not kidding. I could, okay, some of you, like, you're there. I could play guitar, like G, C, D, E, A, B sharp minor. Like, I could do stuff. Not great, but it worked. And for 3 months, I played guitar and led our team in music, and it was part of our experience together. I still look back on that. Now, being who I am, I'm like, I'm the next Jimi Hendrix. I was so excited. And I think God was like, oh, no. Here's a couple chords to get you through 3 months. Supernaturally, in my sleep, I went to bed and I couldn't play guitar. And I woke up and I could. Because God was giving to our team this gift that we could celebrate music together over these months. Nothing more came out of it. I still don't quite know how to process it. It sounds weird coming out of my mouth, but again, I believe in resurrection from the dead. So there's this foundation that the supernatural can happen. And as we think about the series and wrapping it up in music, and where we're going to be today is in a song called Good Grace. You may know this song, you may not know this song, but I want you to hear this song because songs, they interact with the human heart. But that means there's two things. There's the music and there's the heart. And the heart is a little problematic in all of this. I want to tell you about a story Jesus told. He gathered people around and he said, there's a farmer. This farmer went out and he took some seed and he scattered it around, and everyone leans in because when Jesus is talking, he's always talking about the stuff that explains who we are and who God is and how we can be made right with him, and people lean in. He goes, well, so it turns out some of the seed, it fell on the path, and these birds came down, they picked it up, and that seed never took root. And he continues, he goes, some of the seed fell on rocky ground, but there just wasn't a lot of soil. So it grew up a little bit, but then the sun came out, and the sun was hot, and the seed didn't have the foundation it needed, and it withered, and it died. And he continues, and he says that some seed fell in the thorns. Now, this seed did take root. It went down, and the plant grew up, but so did the thorns. And they choked it out, and the seed was no good for harvest. And then he ends, he said, other seed fell in good ground, good soil, and that seed took root, and it produced life. Something like it did what it was supposed to do. Something grew out of it. And then Jesus goes on. He doesn't always do this in his parables, but he goes on and explains what he's getting at. He says, this seed, it's the word of God. It's the good news of God. It's the message of the kingdom of God. And the farmer, God, the Father, he scatters this seed, and the seed falls on the path. And the path it's just hard. It's a hard heart. And the seed just can't go anywhere. And there's one who just opposes you. His name's the enemy or the devil or the opposer. And he just takes that seed away. Maybe you felt like that's happened to you in your life. You feel like you're trying almost, but just nothing takes. You're eager, you're willing, you're even leaning in. And then Jesus said, and there's other, that the soil, the seed that's the shallow soil, it's the heart that gets excited about the good news. The heart that says, yes, Jesus is irresistible. He's changing my life. Yeah, but you know what? It's a lot of work and time, and I've got other things I'm real passionate about. And that seed grows up, and maybe that's been you at times. Maybe you know someone like that, or maybe that's right where you are. Maybe that's been a cycle for you. And then he's really clear on this one. He goes, and you know the thorns that choke it out. He looks at this audience, and it feels like he's talking to like America 2023 right here at Eastwind in Boise, because it's the human experience. He goes, that seed, it did grow up, but it just got crowded out by two things, riches and the worries of life. We can just talk about that every day. Like, anyone struggling with riches and the worries of life? Like Jesus says, that seed it didn't compete. Those thorns, they choked it out. And he says in that fourth soil, that's the one who receives. And the seed takes root. And it grows up and it produces life. And as I was thinking about like heading into talking about grace in this song today, I think it's important to kind of explore like where we might be at, the condition of our heart. So, and I'm not sure if this is linear. It's like hard path, get the rototiller, good soil, or if it's like any given day, you might be bouncing between these four. There's no real clear way to know exactly how it works. So just think about your own life. Some days, some weeks in my life, some months, I'm like the soil's just not there. I'm just like, I do not want to receive what God has for me. But the goal is always to say, God, can you take this hard heart and can you make something of it? And I use the word hard heart. I want to tell you why in just a moment, but first I'm going to ask you a question. Initially, I was going to ask you what the soil of your heart is like, and I'm like, whoa, that's kind of intense. So instead, let's just talk about someone you know. You can be like, yeah, so someone I know, their heart's kind of like really hard right now. Like, just so you can keep it kind of anonymous in the question. But turn to your neighbor. We do a few questions on a morning. Turn to your neighbor right now. Just ask, and if you can speak to yourself, go, honestly, this is where I'm at. This is where I'm at. Like, I feel like it's fertile and the seed's taking root. Or maybe you go, I am choked out right now. Or someone I know is choked out right now by riches and the worries of life. So take a minute, start this conversation. This is definitely like pick it up over lunch and keep it going. But take a minute, start the conversation. We'll be back.
Chip on my shoulder, it feels like a mountainside, trying to climb it, but it's way too high. Been pointing my finger, the log in my own eye. It's like forgiveness in short supply.
Take just a second. It's a question I think about a lot. Like when I'm looking at what's going on in my own life, sometimes I pause and I go, okay, so Jesus speaks to people and he says, hey, the heart can be like this. But here's what I started to realize. Jesus is steeped in an understanding of the Old Testament. And he goes as far as to say, what you're going to find is that I've come to bring this to completion, to take this and bring it into its fullness. All this Old Testament that you've read, and there's this prophet, Jeremiah. Jeremiah talks about the human heart in a very non-flattering way. And here's how he sets it up, though. Jeremiah's talking about the people of Israel. And he's like, someday your heart's going to be connected with God. It's going to be so beautiful. And he goes, but you're also going to hurt and struggle and suffer. And then he says this line, which is like overtly offensive. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Like that alone, the heart is deceitful is enough. Step deeper, above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? And Jesus looks out at the crowds and says, I want to tell you how this works. Your life, my life, we're a place that receives the good news of Jesus Christ, this heart. And the problem is it's got a tensity, an intentionality or a leaning towards or a proclivity towards not being a very good place to grow anything. So when I think about this, I go, oh, I don't like, I know there's a screen up there, but I go, this is true about me, and I'm not a big fan of that. And then someone sent me a reel that brought it all home. It was basically, what are we like? Well, we take in things that are not life-giving to us, that bring pain, that bring disappointment, that bring in discouragement, that even break relationships. Things that when we become adults, we get really good at hiding, and then we try to develop skills and habits and communities that can help us break out of years of hiding these things. The human experience of the heart is like this. The kiwi, think of it not as a piece of fruit, as anything that's not good for your heart. Watch what we do. As cute as that kid is, they're modeling something for us. They're modeling what we started doing because of the condition of our heart and what we continue doing, what we became quite good at doing. Eventually, this kid just likes kiwis because just continually leans into and ignores the overt rejection of this is not something I like, but you know what? My heart's deceitful beyond all things and beyond cure. And so I just kind of learned how to live with this system. And then here's what happens. We, throughout history, we develop religious systems to fix that heart. The problem with religious systems is they often leave out one reality. The reality is that we are pretty bad at the core. And I'm going to borrow someone else's language to help say this. Tim Keller was a pastor and writer, and he can offend us, so I don't have to. He says, grace, which is what we're going to talk about today, he says, grace humbles you and affirms you. You are so bad, Jesus had to die for you. But you're so loved that Jesus was willing to die for you. And that's going to be kind of what we talk about today. Is that our condition? Is that actually day to day what we're living in? And is that what Jesus offers us and why grace is so beautiful, so incredible, so overwhelming, so transformative for the human heart? It brings about whole new opportunities of living. And so the song's called Good Grace. You may know it's been around a few years. Here's where I was introduced to the song. I walked into my bathroom one day and my daughter's handwriting was on the mirror. Focus on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. And I sat there and I was like, my goodness, if that's what my kid is starting every day taking in, there's not a better way you could start out your day. Focus on this one truth, because there's going to be a lot of them. Focus on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. And I did a little research, and that was a lyric to a song, and the song is called Good Grace, and we're going to hear part of it to end our Songs of Summer series. And we're going to come back at the end, and we're going to sing this song together. And I hope for those of you that have received and experienced the good grace of God, you go, I'm all in on this. I can't wait to sing this. So I'd like to invite the band up, and they're going to, again, do the first part of the song, first verse for us, just kind of acoustic, and you can hear how it sets up. And then I'm going to talk with you about grace for a little bit, and we're going to come back and sing. No, I do not want to play guitar right now, Leif. The whole morning, train wreck after that.
Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth: God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where your help comes from.
Gotta warn you, what comes next is like, whoa, 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 if you know the song. We're gonna be doing that later, so gear yourself up for that, okay? So this song speaks to the core message as Jesus looks out at his friends and followers and those who are suspicious and those who are skeptical and says, I've got to tell you, like, the human heart's got a problem, and I'm setting a course in action that's gonna solve that problem. It's going to culminate in his arrest and his beating and his brutal death and his burial, but it doesn't culminate there. It culminates in his resurrection. And so I want to explore and walk through this and talk a little bit about what good grace could look like. And hopefully for each of us, we can, to some degree, say, can I say to myself, focus on this one truth: God is madly in love with me. Madly in love with me, because the tension we run into a lot is this. As a preacher, for years I've heard this. I get about the grace of God, but what about following God? Order of operations really matters. If you start with following God, obeying him, living by his way, to get to his grace, the center of the movement is still you. Still you in that heart, the one that's deceitful beyond all things. If you begin by encountering Jesus and realizing that even you, maybe that's the two words, even you are loved. And if you've never gotten to that place where you can say, even me, I'd encourage you to allow yourself to get there. It's not because you're worth loving because of what you've done. You're worth loving because he sees value in you and loves you even though, and that's part of my story, which I'm going to get to. It's a story that fits really well into Jesus and how he lived. And I mean, the people Jesus was with, he was always crossing over, doing the unexpected, saying and interacting with people in ways that nobody anticipated, or not an inclusive list, but with people like tax collectors who, for Jesus's vocation as a rabbi, would have just been on the outside. Jesus should not interact with these people. Nothing good comes from that. People like Levi and Zacchaeus, and some of you know their stories. You don't need to know them today to really grab hold of. I just want to give sort of a survey of the types of people that Jesus looked at and said, focus on this one truth: God is madly in love with you. Sinners like the woman caught in adultery and like another woman in prostitution. And I'd go as far as to say, like the men who dragged the women caught in adultery into the middle of the street. Sinners. Jesus demonstrated love to them. A paralytic man, a man with a withered hand, a woman with an issue of bleeding, a blind guy with the name Bartimaeus. So we call him Blind Bartimaeus forever. I'm like, I don't know if that's what he wants to be called the rest of his life, but there's the outcasts, like the Samaritan woman at the well. There's outcasts like lepers who are forced to live outside of their community. And there's outcasts, I love this because we have a lot of students in the room, like children. Like for most of history, you guys were kind of like, you're not a lot of use yet, till you get strong enough to fight in our wars or work on our fields. So you live in a slightly different time but Jesus actually crossed over those lines and was like, I like teenagers. I like kids. Bring them to me. I want them to hear about the goodness of the kingdom of God. Socioeconomic, ethnic, political, people of all sorts of divisions. Jesus brought them together. A thief on a cross. We don't know a lot of this person's story, just shows up briefly. Jesus looked at them, said, focus on this one truth: God is madly in love with you. And I would go as far as to say even a rich man named Nicodemus, a rich religious leader, someone who thought they had it all figured out. He also encountered the good news, the good grace of Jesus Christ. I'm going to talk to you about three people today, just a survey, a little look at our history, because if you're following Jesus, knowing where you've come from, knowing what the foundation is really important. And if you're exploring or seeking who is Jesus, knowing where you've come from, knowing who are the people, what was it like, why do we know their stories, it's so critical. I want to start with this guy, Paul. We do mention Paul a lot. He's a controversial historical figure, foundational author of many of the letters that we find in the New Testament of the Bible. Paul's story arc is this. I want to talk about good grace, enemy to family. That's a storyline right there. Wait, not just enemy to friend, enemy to family. It all begins, we're introduced to him in the book of Acts. And so those Pew Bibles, those Bibles that are in front of you, if you ever want to follow along, I'm doing a little extra work. I'm pulling out page numbers for you. So page 887 on that brown Bible in front of you, if you want to follow along with any of the things I'm looking at today, okay? But we're going to be in Acts chapter 7, page 887. Now I really hope that page number's right. I'm not sure I double checked it, right? So let's kind of see how this story unfolds. So Stephen is one of the early followers of Jesus. And while he's speaking about the good grace of God, people get upset because they go, no, it's not about the good grace of God. It's about proving you're good enough. They get so enraged with what Stephen says about Jesus, they pick up stones and they begin to bash him with the stones. And that's where we're introduced to Paul, who goes from enemy to family. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And then he fell on his knees. And he cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And you already see the good grace, the soil of his heart. He begins to look a lot like Jesus. Because this is what Jesus said in his final moments. Father, please do not hold this sin against them. And Stephen says, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And then we're introduced to Saul, Paul. He didn't have like a grand name change. There's just translations of his name. We're introduced to him. And Saul, Paul, approved of their killing him. So that's Acts chapter 7. We're introduced to this guy, and this is how we meet him. He just approves of this guy getting beaten to death with stones for announcing the goodness of Jesus Christ. The text goes on to tell us at the beginning of chapter 8 that at that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And so people were scattered all over Judea and Samaria. And then it says, godly men, so the friends of Stephen took him, and I would say heartbroken, but not grieving as the world does, but heartbroken. They took him and they mourned deeply for him. They watched their friend die in front of them in the very outset of this movement. And then we find in verse 3 where we hear more about Saul in Acts chapter 3. But Saul, Paul, began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women, and he put them in prison. Then Acts chapter 8 takes a little break, and it tells us about this guy, Philip, who goes out into the desert and meets an Ethiopian eunuch. And the guy's reading the Old Testament scroll of Isaiah. He's like, who's this about? And Philip goes, it's Jesus. And baptism happens. And that's one of the first recorded stories of baptism in Jesus' name. But then it picks back up. It's like, oh, let's get back to Paul, though. He's up to some devious stuff. Tells us, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. That's Acts chapter 9. Starting in verse 1. He's run into a problem, though. He's like dragged off and arrested and persecuted everybody he can. He's all out of people to persecute. So he goes to the high priest and asks for a letter to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found anyone else, he's like, I need to take this program to some other cities. There's probably people following Jesus there too, people who ran away, people who fled. I'm going to go find them. If I find anyone there who belongs to the way, this is just the early way the followers of Jesus were described, people of the way. Whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. That sets up Saul, Paul, enemy. Let's just see there's the brief moment where he begins to become family. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and he heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? If I was God, I would do this way different. I'd be like pyrotechnics, WWE, WWF, I'd be kicking stuff. I'd kick Paul off his horse. And then once he's off his horse, I would toss him around. I'd probably tie him to the horse and drag him through the desert for a little while. And then I'd be like, yo, bro, it's Jesus. There's a good reason we're not in his shoes, by the way. Because he says, I heard a voice saying to him, Saul, why are you against me? What's driving you? What's motivating you? And he says, who are you, Lord? He's struck. He says he loses his sight. And people around him can hear what's going on. He's talking. They're like, he's going crazy. Saul asked, and Jesus says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. He replied. Now, Saul of Tarsus was a devout Jew, and we saw he initially persecuted the church. He was an enemy. And in this moment right here, something happens. He's led by his traveling party to Damascus. And at Damascus, he ends up going to a guy named Judah's house. Judah lives on Straight Street, okay? And Paul's in his basement. And God has a dream. In a dream comes to a man named Ananias. He says, Ananias, I need you to go to Judah's house on Straight Street. Saul, the enemy, is there. He's now your family. Ananias goes to that basement, puts his hands on Saul, and he prays for him. He welcomes him in the family. Saul sees again Paul. He gets his sight back. And in that moment, he transitions from enemy to family. And you can't find a story in the New Testament scriptures or in early church history, in many of our lives, of anybody coming to God that's like, I just figured it out and I did it and I just stayed the same. And it's just like a thing I added to my life. Paul's life was forever changed. He received good grace. He had to go, even me. And Jesus looked at him and said, Paul, I want you to focus on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. And once you receive that, the rest of your life, you can just spend asking God, here I am. What do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? So Paul traveled the Mediterranean, and he planted churches and he met with Christians. And sometimes when he came into town, they were all nervous because they thought maybe he's here to trick us. Like maybe he's here like undercover and he's going to arrest us. Eventually they realized that not only was he a friend, he was family. And ultimately he's in prison. And from prison, he writes many of his letters. We're going to be reading his letter to Colossians as a church in the fall. We're going to be looking at lessons from the letter in Colossians and how he says to them, I want you guys to know Jesus is above everything. And you realize when you look at his life, he got it. He experienced it. Jesus was above everything. And that very Jesus looked at him and said, Paul, focus on this one truth. Now, those of you who are super literal are going to be like, the Bible never says that. So just roll with me with it. Focus on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. So that's Paul. Last week, Katie talked about Peter. She told us the story of how Peter went to Cornelius' house and he was like, look at what a great Jew I am. You wouldn't believe I even showed up at your house. But Peter went through transformation. I want to tell you about Peter now. The second example of focus on this one truth of good grace. Peter's journey is from unbelief to belief. If you know his story arc, it works like this. He believed. He was out fishing one day, and this up-and-coming rabbi was on the shores of the sea, and he said, Peter, I want you and your brother and your friends, you guys come follow me. And it was a little different because rabbis didn't do that. You applied for rabbi school, and then you'd go to rabbi school, and you would kind of present your portfolio, and only the best of the best got into be a rabbi, got to be a follower or disciple of a rabbi. Jesus is just walking the streets going, you look like you dropped out. Come with me. And person by person, he invites them to be his followers. And Peter believes. We see the story of the New Testament captures Peter and Jesus and the followers and the kingdom of God. But then there's a moment where Peter's like, Jesus, I'll die for you. And Katie talked about Peter like tried to cut a guy's head off at Jesus' arrest. That's how passionate he was. But within hours, he was asked, hey, aren't you one of Jesus's followers? And he was like, well, it's a guy that looks like me. And then someone else said, wait, I feel like I saw you with Jesus. He's like, I mean, I have that face. I just have that face. It looks really common. And then a little while later, there's this little girl. She's like, aren't you one of Jesus' followers? And Peter's like, no, I never knew the man. And then a rooster does what? Crows 3 times. And in shame, Peter hangs his head because he's disbelieved. He hangs his head. And we don't find out much about him until Jesus meets him resurrected. And Jesus welcomes him back, and Peter re-believes. And then he dies that's his story arc. He dies for his belief. But let's get to the closing moments and how it got there. We're going to be looking at Peter's story from John chapter 21. That's page 881 if you've got that Bible in front of you. John chapter 21. Here's what's happened to set up this moment. Jesus has risen from the dead. And he's looked at a discouraged, hopeless, disappointed group of people who thought they put all their trust in someone who was a lie. And he said it wasn't a lie. Not only have I come to bring the good news, the foundation of that good news is going to be that I've come and I've overcome even death itself. It's evidenced by me standing in front of you right now, he says. And Peter re-believes. But then do you know what he does? I don't know what you would do in this situation. He's not like, Jesus, what do you want to do? He's like, oh, Jesus is risen from the dead. Let's go fishing. Now, a lot of you, this is Idaho. A lot of you are like, totally makes sense. Like, yeah, let's go fishing. But it wasn't that kind of fishing. You didn't fish for like 8 hours and put it all back and take pictures of it. It was like hard work all day long. That's where they go. They're back on their boats. They're back in their nets. They're right where the story started. And Jesus shows up on the beach. He says, let's cook some of this fish up. I need to talk to you all. And he pulls Peter aside. And this is the conversation they have. When they finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? None of us really know what these are because Jesus didn't say, but if you look at the conversation around it and you look at the scholarship in church history, there's two general ideas. One is that Jesus is kind of looking at the other disciples and going, I mean, come on, you love me the most, don't you? And you love me more than these guys, which just seems off brand for Jesus. Just a little bit like, Simon, I know I'm resurrected, but you still like me, right? That's a little bit, but it could be. That could be. The other idea is that Jesus sees what Simon did, countered the resurrected Jesus, and he said, I don't know what's going on, but I know how to fish. And I know fishing, I know what to do there. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to do what I know how to do. And Jesus looks at him, he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he points at the sea and the boats and the nets and his fellow fishermen. This thing you've built your life on, this thing you trust, this thing you were doing day in and day out for most of your life, do you love me more than the things you trusted before I called you? Do you love me more than the things you counted on before I called you? And Simon looks at him and says, yes, Lord. It's a sweet moment. You know I love you. Well, Jesus said, feed my lambs. And then Jesus ruins the moment because he doubles down. Simon's loving this. He's like, oh, Jesus, I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs, which was, Jesus didn't have lambs. It was like people, like take care of the people. And then Jesus goes, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And in Greek, there's a fantastic interplay of words going on here, but that's not the point of today's message. I just want to show you the grace that Peter received and how even after denying Jesus and even after going back to the things he used to trust, Jesus is still like, focus on this one truth. I'm madly in love with you. Focus on this one truth. I'm madly in love with you. And so he says one more time, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And I just love the honesty of the scriptures. Peter was hurt. Like, can you relate? You ever talk to somebody like, are we still friends? Yeah, we're still friends. Are we still friends? Yeah, we're still friends. And then you're like, well, they're needy, right? There's a little emotion. Jesus seems a little emotionally needy. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? Watch how Peter responds. He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. And Jesus is saying, focus on this one truth. I'm madly in love with you. You don't need to go back to the things you used to trust. You don't need to rely on the things you used to think you could count on, because I'm going to do something new with you, but it's going to spring forth from me, my good grace being given to you. And you know it was good grace because while these are images of sheep, this is essentially what Peter did with the rest of his life. And maybe it was like this.
Do ba 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 do boo do a boo ba do ba do boo ba do.
Peter would eventually, because of receiving the good grace of Jesus Christ, he would spend his life trying to let people know that the love of God was for all people. But there was an exclusion. Religion doesn't get you there. Your hard work doesn't get you there. Your good old heart doesn't get you there. It needs to be transformed so it can receive the message, and that's what Jesus did. So Peter would spend his time telling people about this until ultimately his death under the hands of the Roman Empire for telling people about this. So I want to ask you a question. So what is good grace to you? And I'm going to end with a more personal story. How do you describe the grace of God? And maybe you're like, I'm not sure about how to describe the grace of God. Well, grace. How does that word operate in your life? Take a minute, start a conversation on how. So if someone to you said, what's the grace of God, or what is grace? Well, what's your answer? What's your sentence you would say back? And then we'll come back and finish up. So you start to notice something the more you're around people who are following Jesus, and you start to talk to them, and somewhere in the story, this encounter with the grace of God emerges, and you start to realize, oh, like grace, although there's a theological definition for it, unmerited favor is probably like the bottom line. It gets more complicated from there, like a gift you don't deserve. But that doesn't like get me out of bed. Unmerited favor, I've encountered grace actually. I've been on the receiving end of Jesus looking at even me and saying, Carlos, focus on this one truth. I'm madly in love with you. And then I come out of that and go, then what would you have me do? How can I, what do you want in my life? How can I follow you? And that becomes this journey I walk with God. And so I want to talk to you about grace. Peter and Paul I know from reading the scriptures and studying the history of the church, but there's one guy I know better. And this is me, my sister, and my mom. And we talk about grace. Because Peter's grace and Paul's grace aren't why I'm here. Because I have received the grace of Jesus Christ. So what happened between this kid, I tried to get it all out last service. I was like, today will be a professional, mature service. So my mom had my sister in high school and then had me. I was born on a hippie commune. I wish I had been there a long time so I could like legitimate say I was a hippie, but she left when I was really young. And so you've got a single mom with no high school degree trying to raise two kids in like poor rural California, trying to figure this out. And so what happens between here and here in a story arc where the good grace of God transforms someone's life? And a lot of you have your own version of this story. Others of you don't yet, and that's why I want you to hear it, because I need you also to believe this reality that God is madly in love with you, even you. The challenge is a lot of us try to get here without believing, without understanding how broken we are. We try to get here by scaling up our lives. The entry point into the goodness of God is looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, I'm pretty sure it doesn't include me. And you find out it does. Even you. So here I am. My mom's trying to figure life out. We move off the commune. Those early years I'm just going to describe as challenging. They were hard on every level. They shaped me in a lot of ways. But things came together, and my mom ended up working a couple jobs, and I just would watch her and go, wow, she's amazing. There was no sign of religion, no sign of Christianity or any other belief system in our home. It was just people trying to make it work. One day, though, she got her GED and enrolled in cosmetology school. And you've heard this story before. Some of you will be the first time. And I was so excited. I'm like, my mom's like, she's doing it. And so I made a sign. I spelled congratulations wrong because I've never been able to spell. I put it up in this little kitchen. We were living in a condemned home at the time, which eventually we had to leave, and it was torn down because it wasn't safe to be in. And in that space, my mom came in, and that's when she was in tears. And I'm like, what's the strongest person I know doing crying right after like the biggest moment of their hardest work they've done to support their family and take care of their kids? And that's when she looked at me and she said, I met Jesus. And it's not a joke. And I was like, I thought Jesus was a Hispanic man she went on a date with. And I was like, what? What'd he do to you? And in that moment, she's like, no, Carlos. And here's what happened. My mom got tricked. One of her classmates was like, hey, I got a prayer meeting. Not one of her classmates, someone whose hair she was working on said, hey, you need to come to this women's Aglow meeting. It was like a super intense prayer meeting. My mom thought it was like, we're going to get margaritas. Super intense prayer meeting. They prayed for my mom. And she said, even me? Focus on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. Well, I didn't receive that message well. In response to that, I became a seeker of everything but Jesus, anything contrary to Jesus. I would be one of those kids, some of you might have been there too, or maybe you're there now, where I'm like, I'm an atheist. I didn't quite know how to shape that up, but I read aggressively against all the claims of Jesus Christ, and my mom was gentle and faithful with me. But I started to find that through my mom's new relationship, I started to get connected to families from church, and they would have me over. I made new friends. I started to be around other people. And then I had my first encounter with God that I can remember. And it was on the hills of Ensenada with a Christian youth group like the ones we have here. I went along kind of as a poser, but really just a really cute girl who was on the trip. And I went along, and they would sing. And so music comes into play. They would sing, and the music was not very good. And there was a guy with a keyboard, and the night was wrapping up, and I spent the whole night kind of making fun of him, like this music, like some of you might do sometimes. Like, this church music's just weird, and that was really weird church music. And he says, I'm not going to stop singing. I got to do one more song because somebody out here needs to know that even though they don't know what it's like to be loved by an earthly father, and that's what I thought at the time. I now know my dad was doing his very best, that they can be loved by their heavenly father. He starts singing this song, and I'm like, and then some fool starts crying. And I'm like, I was the person crying, it turns out. I had tears running down my face. The Christian youth group jumped the gun. They're like, he's a Christian. They're all excited. I had to totally ruin the night for them. I'm like, oh, time out. I had a moment, something. I'm not a Christian. So that kind of spoiled that night. But so it continues on, though. So now I've encountered Christian community. I'm starting to soften my heart. This kid, something's happening in his story arc. Honestly, I kind of loved church because all I had to do was show up and some grandmother lady would give me a hug. Be like, so glad you're here. I'm like, oh, this is so much easier than everywhere else in life. Everyone's like, what's the great thing you did for me to give you a compliment today? Come to church. People are like, you're alive. Welcome. So then, my nets, my boats, they were athletics. And I thought, I'm getting out of this town. I'm getting away from this story. I'm going to go be I'm going to get a college degree. I'm going to be somebody. And I had a pretty rough injury that took a lot of that away right in the middle of recruiting season. And I didn't know what to do about that. And I thought, okay, you know what? That same God who brought tears down my cheeks, I bet he can fix this. So I prayed my very first overt prayer. God, just put these tendons back together. Put these ligaments in place. Just fuse these bones. Like, you can do this. And if you do, I'm going to tell everybody you did it. And he didn't. Surprise, I didn't, yeah. So I lay there and I cursed God. And maybe some of you have done that in your life. This is the word I remember the most. I don't even know why I had this in my vocabulary. Impotent. Over and over. I said, you're so impotent. Can't even fix a little ankle? You're nothing. He didn't say it this way, but God leaned in. He said, hey, focus on this one truth. I'm madly in love with you. I couldn't shake it. And so I began to seek, and I spent more time around Christians, and some of you know the longer story. I pretended to be a Christian for a year so I could live in Christian community, housing and with people, because I figured behind the scenes you were super weird. But you're not. You're just like the rest of us behind the scenes. I was like, oh, and I heard over and over about the goodness of Jesus Christ. And after a year of seeking, I encountered that good grace. And this little boy's heart, which was deceitful beyond all things, even him, received the goodness of Jesus Christ. And it brings me to today. And I thought through that story, and I went, if that's kind of my story arc and it's some of yours, what is grace then? Grace is simply this. Not because I am good, but because I'm yours. Not because I'm good, but because I'm yours. And I thought, man, what would I want Eastwind and the guests who come? What would I want you to walk into this week believing more than maybe you started today? And it would be this. It's not because you're good. It's not because you came to church today. It's because there's a heavenly Father who loves you so deeply that he paid the price to restore your relation, to make right your heart so you could be connected again to what you're intended to be connected to, a relationship with the Creator God. That's not because I'm good, but because I'm yours. That's the good grace I get. Peter and Paul, I kind of understand their stories, but my story I live in every day. And my heart sometimes is a hard path, and sometimes it's a shallow soil. And just like you, most days I'm dealing with the worries of life and riches and how that works out. But I know and I've seen Jesus also makes good soil and stuff grows out of it. So Good Grace is a song about that. And we're going to sing that song now. So I want to invite the band back up. And we're doing the last Sunday a little differently. We said normally we sing the song right in the middle. But this song, it's I wanted you to hear it. I wanted you just to hear a story kind of around it. Then I want to invite you, if you've encountered good grace, sing it out. Now, there's a part of this song that's got whoa-whoas in it. I'm not a good singer, but it goes like, whoa, 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 and I just light up at that part, because the other parts of the song I can't sing. Some of you are like, you can't sing that part either. But, so let's just practice real quick. I'm not even helping them, because I think I sing it wrong. But there's this, you're singing like, just swing wide the gates of heaven. I want to experience the goodness of God and focus on this one truth. God's madly in love with you, so take courage. Don't lose heart. And then you go, whoa, whoa, whoa. So stand on your feet real quick. I'm going to warm you up. All right? It just goes like this. I'll sing it out. You repeat it. That's the way we know we're warm. Then they'll try to repair what I have damaged. Okay? So, whoa, whoa, whoa. If you can do that, you can do the whole song. That's the hardest part. All right, so I'm going to turn it over. May we experience the good grace of Jesus Christ. If you've experienced it, sing it out.